My project was about Native Americans and the Irish. So in 1847, three Native American groups or nations, the Choctaws, the Cherokees, and the Creeks, donated money and corn, actually, to the Irish. At the time, the Irish and the Scottish were actually going through a series of famines. So that was between 1845 and 1852. So what happened was the Irish and the Scottish would plant the crops, and then late in the season they realized, the crops were, they were infected with a fungus. And so it was too late to kind of replant and too late to find new food. So, and at the time, the Irish and the Scottish were pretty much only eating potatoes, maybe some buttermilk, maybe some meat every now and then. But otherwise, they were totally dependent on the potato for eating. And so in the end, over the course of 7 years, about 1 million, between 1 million and 1.5 million people died in Ireland, and about between 1.8 and 2 million people actually left. And so my project was focused on the relief efforts. So a lot of the relief efforts for the Irish and the Scottish, mainly for Irish, came from America. And along with this, a lot of people who study relief efforts study the diversity of relief efforts. And one famous story is that the Choctaws, who at the time were living in Oklahoma, donated money to the Irish. And a lot of people kind of just mention it in passing as a diversity story or something. Like, for example, they would mention it alongside Queen Victoria also donating, or the Sultan of Turkey donating, kind of, or slaves donating as well. But they didn't really go into, well, why did the Choctaws donate? And actually the Cherokees donated as well, and so did the Creeks. And so my analysis was focused on why did the Choctaws, why did the Cherokees donate, what were their motivations? And so that was the first part of my essay. And then the second part of my essay was mainly focused on the Choctaws and since the 1990s. And so between the 1990s and like March of this year, of 2018, the Choctaws and the Irish have been communicating with one another. They kind of, like, President Mary Robinson went to Oklahoma to personally thank the Choctaws 150 years later. The Prime Minister, or the President today, did the same, in 2018, did the exact same thing. He went and he thanked them. And similarly, the Choctaws have visited the Irish as well. And so I kind of wanted to see, well, that's what kind of sparked my interest. I wanted to see, well, what's really going on there? I thought that I would find something saying, oh, maybe they were interacting like between 1847 and between 1990s when they started doing famine walks together, and they also created charities with one another. Turns out they weren't really communicating with one another. Some people, a couple philanthropists, actually recovered the story, some in the 1960s, but then that died out again. And then in the 1990s, the story came up again, and it kind of blew up because of a number of reasons. For one, Ireland was more peaceful. For two, Ireland was also more interested in engaging with other countries that were suffering at the time, so decolonizing countries in Africa. They were really interested in helping emerging nations build, and so they thought that it was their duty to do that because they saw the Irish famine as actually the last famine, and so they wanted to help, I guess, alleviate famines in the modern world. And so that's the context of. And so they recovered the Choctaw story, and they said, oh, the Choctaws, who had also gone through their own struggles, just before they donated to the Irish in 1847, they said, oh, they felt our pain, and now we feel their pain, and so let's help alleviate pain together now. So yeah, that was my project.
So how did you go about doing your...
So I went about doing my research. First of all, I started with newspapers. Those were my go-to primary sources. So I actually got access to some of Johns Hopkins newspaper databases. So I could, and also Boston College, and I also have access to University College Cork databases. And so those are all online. And so I just went through typing my keyword, Choctaws, Cherokees, Irish Famine. And so I was looking at newspapers. I looked at newspapers between 1847 and 2018. So there was a lot of stuff I looked at, but most of the resources I ended up using were from actually 1847, 1846, 1845. And so some of these newspapers I looked at, for example, the Cherokees had their own newspapers, which is why I originally wanted to do just the Choctaws, but the Choctaws didn't have a newspaper at the time. They established their first newspaper, the Choctaw Telegraph, in 1848, which was a year after 1847, the year of their donations. And so I went through the Cherokee Advocate to look for indications of just how Native Americans were feeling about the Irish at the time. And so to get access to the Cherokee Advocate was it was difficult at first because I didn't know where to start, because a lot of places, if you go on WorldCat, it shows you all the libraries that have access to the Cherokee Advocate. And so I had to, and so at first I thought, oh, I can access it online. I couldn't. They exist only, at least for 1847. You can get the ones after 1877 online, but for 1847 through 1877, you have to go to either the New York Public Library or to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives. And so between June and July, I was going to Washington, D.C. like 2 to 3 days a week, just combing through all of the newspapers. And it's a really big book. It's bigger than my torso, and the newspapers are very fine. And I couldn't believe I didn't have to wear gloves or anything. I should have, but I was going like this. And so I went through all the newspapers looking for articles about the Irish. And writing the grant took a while. I thought, oh, at first I thought, oh, I'm just going to write this grant proposal. Like, I've done proposals before, like paper proposals, but it's a lot more than that. You have to show that you're willing to kind of go the extra mile. And I had two advisors, Dr. Matthew Mulcahy in the history department, and Dr. Catherine Brennan, also in the history department. And so they really pushed me to fine-tune the grant proposal. And so I went through like 5 drafts, I think, 3 of which were like 2 days before it was due. And so so that process was hard, but I know that they're looking for more and more students. And so in that sense, and I also know I don't think they get a lot of proposals. And so I think that if you're willing to kind of show that you want it really badly, they will find the money. I think they will give it to you. So yeah, but you have to earn it like a lot. Curious, and she sent me this really nice email, and she said that she would help me with anything. She told me where the Cherokee Advocate was and where some of the other primary sources were, and so she was definitely a big help. What I got out of this experience was that I learned a lot about my strengths and my weaknesses in the writing and the research process. So coming into the process, I thought that writing was going to be the easy part because I've always been a pretty good writer. And I've always kind of had trouble locating sources. And so I think that the opposite wound up being true between, I guess, mid-May and June and like the second week in July. I was just collecting tons of primary sources, and I had so many, and I could remember pretty much everything that every source said. The secondary sources were a little harder for me, tracking them down, locating them, or figuring out like which ones were applicable. And then the writing process was very difficult. I should have started earlier for sure. I definitely encourage that. I didn't start until about mid-July. Once I was done, I kind of did it in two separate steps. I think that I should have integrated the steps a little more, just because I realized that I'm a little perfectionistic when I write. And so I need more time to kind of go over the words and to get my thoughts down and then edit. And so I learned that writing is definitely going to be one of the harder things to tackle in the future. But I did learn that collecting primary sources is definitely something I really, really enjoy. And so I'm excited to do that in the future. I think this project, my summer project, will benefit my future plans in that I would like to do a PhD program in history soon. And so I think that this kind of makes me a better candidate for PhD or master's programs. And also, especially considering I'm doing a thesis as well, so experience has also helped me prepare for the process of a thesis, collecting sources. I'm pretty much doing everything all over again in the next 2 semesters. And so I'm happy that I did this experience because I know now how I work and and what to do. And so in the future, I also know now I have like a really great story to tell at interviews, or if I'm talking with a professor, I can talk about my own research because I've kind of always wanted to be like an expert in something or the go-to person. And so I feel that now I may not be an expert, but I can talk about the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Irish, and the Great Famine with a professor and have like a really great intellectual conversation. I would absolutely recommend that other students take advantage of the Center for Humanities grant. I know that for a few of my friends have done it. My friend who's a bio major, actually did a paper on ethics. And I know that graduate schools are looking for diversity in their programs. And so it's like diversity of thought as well. And so I think that if you can show that maybe you're willing to go outside your comfort zone, like my friend did, for example, or in my case, if you're willing to go the extra mile as a young person or be ambitious like I was, and I think that grad schools will be impressed by that. Likewise, I think medical schools are looking for independent thinkers and people who are willing to go the extra mile. I know of people in thesis interview, in grad school interviews or job interviews who talk about their thesis, and so you can also talk about this in interviews as well, or just like I said before, with just a teacher and you want to have a good conversation.